Last week, Jan received a stunning call. Her good friend and police officer Dianne Latchford has been killed, and the suspect is Sam, the man she and Andre have been trying to track down. This week, we catch up with Roger and Tate. I'm your narrator, Chad, and this is episode 15, chapter 19 of No Evil. Let's escape. Roger's first few weeks at Helping Hearts flew by. Jamie made it feel like home. He spent 3 days per week there and the rest of his time trying to scrape together a few bucks. He was saving for a suit, Jamie's suggestion, so he could wear it to interviews. She had promised to match whatever he was able to raise by the end of the month. The shelter opened early, and Roger waited eagerly outside with a couple of other regulars. The cold was set in deep. It had been particularly windy lately, and with the wind chill, the temperature felt at least twice as low. Finally, the door opened. Roger saw it was Tim. Tim was short by most standards and wore a crisp white-collared shirt tucked neatly into tan pants. Roger didn't care for his lectures on God, but it was worth sitting through them for a chance to spend time with Jamie. She was a rare sort of person that radiated positivity. Roger went in, looked around, and saw no sign of her. There wasn't any food ready, but Tim said there was plenty of coffee for anyone who wanted some. Roger took a paper cup from the open bag and loaded it with cream and sugar. He remembered his wife joking often if he wanted some coffee with his cream and sugar. The memory was like broken glass against his heart. Roger took a sip of his coffee, and, looking around, it appeared he was the only one who wanted any. Most of the others headed straight to their beds. He sat up on top of the table, sipped his coffee again, and pulled out his lucky ball. He didn't have any reason to believe the ball was lucky. He'd just found it in a ditch one day, but it was his. That seemed to be luck enough. He threw the ball off the wall, let it bounce off of the stove and back into his hand. Then again. He threw it again, and bang! Like a shotgun, the sound ripped through him. His thoughts unraveled. He could almost see them bursting apart. The resonance came. That's what he called it. It had happened several times since he'd lost his hearing. It would come on in one blast, then he'd seem to hone to it, and vibrated with it until he could understand. But this time was different. This resonance was more powerful. His body continued on throwing the ball, but it was like watching from the back of a theater. He couldn't control his body, but it seemed he had stepped away from it. He was in the theater. He stood up from his seat in the back row. Light from the projector flickered through dust particles in the air. He walked to a doorway and pulled back a curtain. A woman with monstrous boils across her face was naked and gyrating on a man with no head. Through another curtain there was a sea of dead. They gyrated like the woman, to a song he could barely hear, as it floated lazily through the thick air. He pushed through another curtain, and there was nothing. Then a great light flashed, and all he could see was stars. Billions and billions of flickering projector lights swirled en masse into deep gaseous clouds of purple. All at once they shrunk to the size of a basketball. It was clear, and glistened like a marble. The projector lights continued to swirl inside. Then he could see it wasn't one basketball. It was millions, or billions of them, and they floated in the air. The basketballs rolled like they were floating on ocean waves. They moved past each other in a choreographed way. Roger could only witness. He couldn't interact. Then one basketball nicked another, and they seemed to merge at the point of contact. Then it passed through. The room had been dark. Now it filled with stark light. There were walls and shelves, and the basketballs stopped floating. They fell to the floor and bounced and slammed off each other. Roger didn't step back so much as glide back. He went through one curtain, then another, until he was back in his seat. The projector light ran red. Jamie was on the screen, and she was shaking his body. Then Roger heard the voice.
Find them. Find them. They're all going to die. Help him. Help him. Keep a vigilant eye.
The voice deepened to a roar.
A firefly is not a fly.
Roger snapped back into his body. Jamie was standing in front of him looking worried. He apologized and hurried out of the room and across to the exit. He needed some fresh air. He needed to know what the hell was happening. And most of all, he needed a drink. The amount of blood was immense. The sick metallic smell of it lingered in the air, and Tate lay in it beside Jeff and Sierra. He wept and looked up at his own hands. They were dripping with sin and blood, and he could blame no one but himself. Jeff's skull was caved in on the side, and Sierra had her organs and blood squeezed from her like pulp from an orange. All of it the result of just a thought. Tate turned and looked into Sierra's eyes. He cried again at the emptiness in them. Tate propped himself up and walked to the stairs. He steadied himself with one bloody hand on the railing and ascended them. Then he crawled into bed, pulled a blanket over his head, closed his eyes, and slept. The next day Tate woke, and the first thought that came to him was Sierra's flat black eyes. He raised a hand to wipe the sleep from his own eyes and found it stained dark brown. His blankets, pillows, and sheets were covered as well. Tate walked into the bathroom and saw himself in the mirror. Dark patches of blood covered his hands and clothes, and his face was speckled in it. He undressed, got in the shower, and scrubbed clean. Afterward, he took the blankets, sheets, and pillowcases off of the bed, stuffed them in a large garbage bag, and took them outside. He'd crafted a large fire pit. It was big enough to fit at least 10 people around comfortably, although he was the only one to ever use it. He tossed the garbage bag and all into the center, and pulled out a small yellow bottle of lighter fluid from his back pocket. He emptied most of the bottle onto the garbage bag, then used the remainder to soak a rag he had secured to a long stick. He lit the rag and used it to light the garbage bag in several places. He turned and went back inside. Across from the front door, Jeff and Sierra lay where he'd left them. He went to the stairs and climbed them again. A search of the closet produced another set of sheets and pillowcases and a large winter blanket he'd neglected to put on the bed. He usually only used it for the coldest winter nights when the dying fire from the wood stove left the house chilly enough to wake him before work. He dressed the bed, then crawled under the covers again. After a short time he managed to forget the eyes, and the stench, and the sin. He managed to push out of his fear and shame, and let sleep in. He dreamed of a carnival where Jeff played the clown. The next day he ventured downstairs for some food. He woke with a fierce growl in his stomach and realized he hadn't eaten anything in something like a day and a half. Jeff and Sierra were pale and slumped in front of the refrigerator. The pool of blood had dried and curled, and the stink was growing with each second. With the thought, Jeff's limp corpse rose a couple of inches from the ground.
Right.
Jeff's body moved slowly to the right, his hand dragging behind. Tate set him off to the side in front of the kitchen table. He didn't imagine he'd be using it under the circumstances anyway. Next, Tate lifted Sierra. Her body flipped and flopped awkwardly. Most of her bones had been broken. Tate placed her on top of Jeff. Tate examined the contents of his fridge quickly and came away with some bologna and a bag of bread. He made himself a sandwich, then took a bite. He closed the fridge and turned to go back upstairs. From the corner of his eye he saw movement. Sierra's head limply flopped to one side, and her dead eyes stared directly at Tate. They bulged out, and her swollen tongue protruded. Her face was pastel green. His stomach began to roll, and he forced the bite of sandwich down. Then he returned to his bedroom, finished the sandwich, and slept again. When he woke again, it was to the sound of metal grinding. He ran to his window and found his sculptures had moved again throughout the night. Then he smelled them. After 4 days of letting them sit in his kitchen, Tate finally had to address what he'd done. He went to the shower and pulled off the vinyl curtain. He spread the shower curtain out across the kitchen floor and then elevated the bodies into the center and wrapped them in it. The curtain wasn't big enough for both of them, but he piled Sierra on top of Jeff and looped it around them. Then he used his mind to lift them out the door and into the backyard. From a rusting aluminum tool shed, Tate took a pickaxe and a shovel. There was about 4 inches of snow on the ground, and the earth was frozen solid. Tate pulled out a folding chair from inside the tool shed, sat down, and got to work. The pickaxe struck the ground first, and with such thumping force that Tate felt the impact from where he was sitting. It pulled out of the ground and hit again, this time harder, and the pick sank a foot into the ground. Tate repeated the motions in his mind. All the time he felt he could force the pickaxe to strike harder and faster, and it did. After a couple of hours, the hole was wide enough and deep enough to fit both Jeff and Sierra. He lifted them up from where he sat and dropped them coldly into the hole. The shovel scooped the freshly dug earth back into the pit. When it was finished, Tate knelt by the grave. Seeing it made him sick. He couldn't do it. They couldn't be dead. He wouldn't leave their bodies alone to be lost forever. He lay on his face across the filled grave, bawling. Then he felt a spark like static electricity build at the back of his throat.
Bring them back.
The thought crept into his mind like a whisper. He didn't know what to make of it. He paused, looking around as if he'd see the source of the voice. Then he raised up from the grave and took a step back. His hands trembled. The static, Ozone-tasting feeling lurched in his throat again.
Bring them back.
A hiss of feedback inside his head rose up. Tate eyed the grave as he pictured Sierra's dull eyes. He was about to beg for forgiveness. Then the taste of metal bitterness was gagging him when the ozone scraped out of the back of his throat like a ball of spikes. It burst out in a painful white light and twirled around his arm. The light moved like a snake on the ground and sank deep into the freshly dug earth. A moment later, a hand punched through the top. Tate reeled backward and tripped over the shovel. The corpses pushed themselves from the earth. The light, flaring in juts like crab legs, crept out of Sierra and plunged into Jeff's ear. It went back and forth between them. Both of the formerly limp bodies teetered to their feet and shambled forward as if controlled like marionettes. The light blasted from Jeff again, gathered in a ball, and rocketed into Tate's vision. For a beat he thought he'd been stricken blind, but his vision soon cleared. Jeff and Sierra, a couple of meat puppets with empty eyes, stood at Tate's feet. His mother didn't move, and neither did his father. He just stared at her, expecting her to come back to her feet. Something burned in the kitchen, and smoke began to roll in. The fire alarm went off. They sat there silently watching her. Finally, his father knelt beside her and felt her neck with 2 fingers. Then he stood up, took a rapid step backwards, and raised a hand to his forehead. He wiped across it with the back of his hand, and it ran slick with sweat. He stood there for close to 20 minutes just looking at her. "Get out of here." "What?" "Get out of this room. Now," his father said. "Where do I go?" "I don't care. Don't come back." The last time Tate O'Byrne saw his parents, his father was standing over his unconscious mother. Tate tried to see if she was still breathing, but when he stepped beside her, his father shoved him hard to the ground. His father's eyes were wild like he'd never seen them. There were demons in those eyes Tate didn't care to know. So he left. Tate, unsure whether he'd ever be back, knew enough to pack a bag with all his clothes. It had been years since he'd seen his old room. It was still framed in baby blue trim and bright white walls. He took few possessions. He didn't really know them. He carried the bag over one shoulder and turned to look back to the room he called home. His father was still standing, still staring at his unmoving mother. Tate saw a jar of loose change on the counter on his way out and tucked it under his arm. The late afternoon sun was bright and blinding. It was at an angle that made the shadows long, and Tate couldn't help but fear them. He made a brisk pace to the nearest payphone, loaded in a quarter, and dialed 911. Then he ran away as far as he could get. And that's all for episode 15, chapter 19 of No Evil. If you're enjoying the podcast, let us know what you think in the comments. Give us a like, a share, a town committee chair. Do all the social media things. Become an escapist by subscribing and clicking the bell. And you know what else you could do? You could take a trip to Pennsylvania Dutch country. That's it. Just do that. Take some photos. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you at the next escape.